Welcome to Who's In, the ultimate college football playoff show. It's time to talk about another exciting week on the gridiron. Here are your hosts, Jack Epler, Tom Crawford, and Ken Hoffman.
Great evening and welcome to Who's In, our weekly look at the 12-team college football playoff, what has happened in the past week, what we have coming up, and a number of special guests. Very happy to welcome in Tom Crawford, my longtime broadcast partner, Blue Belly Tom, and covering Michigan forever and watching the Wolverines since the early 1960s. Tom, how are you?
Well, I'm doing good. A crazy weekend in college football. What 4 teams in the top 10 go down. It's what I love about college football, the unexpected. And, man, this year it's unexpected on steroids, man. How about those Commodores? Not the singing group, but the university. Vanderbilt. Wow. Unbelievable win over Bama.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of very interesting games in the Big Ten. And we'll talk more about that conference in just a few moments with a very special guest. Also want to welcome in Ken Hoffman, longtime university publicist, and he's a co-founder of a bowl game. We're talking about the Motor City Bowl and the Little Caesars Bowl. Ken, how are you?
Doing great, Jack. Happy to be here.
I would love to have been in Nashville Saturday night carrying that goalpost 25 blocks. Can you imagine what that was like?
What a zoo in Nashville, but for a very good reason, obviously. It's been 40 years since the Commodores beat Alabama, and they had never defeated a number one team in the country in the past.
Yeah. 0-60, Tom, against top 5 teams. Can you imagine that?
No, I cannot relate to that, Jack, but they hung in there. Hey, Nick Saban better not say going to Nashville is an easy place in the SEC. He kind of threw his school under the bus that way and fired up the Commodores.
That was maybe the most controversial thing Nick Saban said since he told Don Shula he was not leaving the Dolphins.
Yeah,
and then wound up in Baton Rouge a couple of days later. Ken, what was the highlight to you for the weekend? And you want to tell us a little bit about the special guest we're going to have in just a moment.
Yeah, I don't know which one to do first. I'm pretty excited about our special guest, and I want to introduce him when we get him on camera. There were so many games that impressed me over the weekend. And as Tom mentioned, 4 of the top 10 go down, et cetera, et cetera. You know, besides the biggest shocker, which was Vanderbilt beating Alabama, I was really impressed with Texas A&M and that victory over Missouri, 41-10. I mean, they are back. They are back, and the reason they're back is their quarterback is back. Connor Wegman got hurt in the opener against Notre Dame. I thought Texas A&M was going to win that. They lost, but Wegman went out. He came back this week, and he's a difference maker.
Tom, when you think about P.J. Fleck and Minnesota, and they lost that game on a missed field goal beginning of the year to North Carolina, and now they come back, and here they are against USC. They've got 4th and goal inside the 1.
Yeah.
All they have to do is kick the ball, and he says, nope, we're going for it, and they got it.
Which was the right strategy in the long run, because with Miller Moss, he's going to get you down into range. So he went for the win, and that was a great win for Minnesota. I was very happy for them, and they're playing great ball. I mean, they played obviously well against Michigan, and watch out for all these teams in the Big Ten. They're all good. Everybody's good. Going on the road is going to be brutal, especially in the SEC. You go on the road in the SEC, you better be ready to play football.
Ken, you had some involvement with SEC teams and teams from all conferences when you were helping to run the Motor City Bowl with George Perlis, and you wonder how conferences are different, but I guess we're going to find out in a couple minutes.
Well, yeah, they're certainly a lot bigger than they used to be. We have coast-to-coast conferences now, and of course the Big Ten has now 18 teams, the largest of the Power 4 conferences. And yes, when I was still in the bowl business, we had teams from just about every conference. And I remember our very first game back in 1997, we had Ole Miss against Marshall and Randy Moss. And that was a great start to a 17-year run there in Detroit. So we had some wonderful matchups. In 2010, we had 60,000 people at Ford Field for Purdue in Central Michigan. We had some great shows for sure.
Guys, you talk about that year, and Tom, I've been the Heisman State Representative Chairman since 1986. Jerry Green bestowed that honor on me. And of all of the years, that was the hardest year to vote by far. There were 4 guys who deserved to be on every ballot, and there were only 3 slots. And I must have ripped up 10 pieces of paper.
Well, that shows you take your job seriously and with integrity. You don't just phone it in. So that speaks well of you. But I mean, it's like we get the Heisman talk, we got this CFP thing is mesmerizing. I mean, I'm thinking about all day Saturday. Who's going to be my number one? And I flip back and forth. I see optically Ohio State's looking really good, although they had a slow start against Iowa. But they're really good. And so I like the idea that, the Ken prescribed, stay in the moment, stay as we sit today, because coming forward. I mean, you got Texas OU, and then you got Georgia on the 19th of October going to Austin to play Texas. And we're going to have a riveting show a couple of nights after that.
Tom, you have covered that game in Dallas, and I think you've told me that it's split 50-50.
It is.
It's hard to find a regular season game, even at Vanderbilt or in Evanston, where half of the fans are not for the home team, but there is no home team here. It's kind of like Georgia, Florida.
Yeah, it certainly is. And Ken, I think your guest is on. He's ready to go.
Well, that's good to hear. We're looking forward to seeing Tony Petitti, the seventh commissioner in the history of the Big Ten Conference. He's in his second year now as commissioner, and hopefully he'll be on here in a minute.
There he is.
And there he is. Commissioner, good to see you.
Good to see everybody. Coach, good to see you. I'm going to call you Coach if that's okay.
That's absolutely okay. And
what kind of coach was he, Tony? What kind of coach was Ken Hoffman?
He was way ahead of his time with the passing game. I can tell you that.
That's right. We ran.
Hang you an effigy, Ken. How about that?
We ran like the earliest version of the spread anybody had ever seen. Unfortunately, we couldn't block anybody.
That was the biggest problem. And for those of you who probably don't know what Tony is talking about, back in a half century ago, Tony, 1975, Woodbury Academy, Long Island, New York. I was Commissioner Petitti's football coach. Of course, he wasn't a commissioner at that time, but he has had a pretty amazing accomplishment, success in sports and business and television. So, Tony, I need you to sit back for a minute because I've got a few things I want to say about you. And the first thing you need to know about Tony is that he's a 1986 graduate of Harvard Law School. That ought to tell you something right off the bat. But there's, of course, much more. He has been, for nearly 4 decades now, he's been one of the most influential, one of the most successful individuals in college sports, pro sports, business, and television. And in particular, the last 22 years have been pretty remarkable. And I just want to touch on some of the highlights. If you want to fully appreciate what this man has accomplished, you need to go to the Big Ten website and read his bio, which is going to take you a few minutes, believe me. But when you're done, you will sit there, you will admire it, you will appreciate it, and you will probably be a little stunned by what this man has done. I don't know what just happened there.
You're good.
You're good.
Let me see if I can get, there we go, back on. So thank you. So in 2002 to 2008, Tony held senior executive roles at CBS Sports and at ABC Sports. And he had many duties there, but perhaps the most important one was to acquire the rights to major college and pro sporting events. And there's a whole list that you'd have to read on his bio. But the one I'm going to mention that he acquired the rights for is this little event that comes around once every March, known as the NCAA Men's Basketball Tournament, fondly known as March Madness. And Tony was the man who acquired the rights for that. Then, of course, from 2008 to 2014, he was named president and CEO of Major League Baseball Network. Now, there was no network at the time. Tony is the one who led the creation, the development, the build-out, and the launch of MLB Network to some 50 million homes, which at that time was the largest cable launch in history. So he did such a marvelous job there that, of course, Major League Baseball said, well, we need to move him on up. And from 2014 to 2020, Tony was the deputy commissioner and the chief operating officer of MLB, Major League Baseball. He has won, are you ready for this? He has won 14 National Sports Emmy Awards, which are given out for outstanding contribution in American sports television. 14. I think Alan Alda might hold a little bit more than Tony, but not by a whole lot. So, Tony, I want you to know what a great feeling I have right now after 49, going on 50 years, that we were back in Woodmere Academy, Long Island, New York. And it's such an honor for you to be with us here on the Who's In podcast. And I just want to welcome you in. And I'm going to ask you a question here in just a minute, but welcome to the show.
Thank you. And if you can indulge me for a few seconds, I just want to remind you of a story that when I was at ABC doing college football programming, we would meet with coaches, and we had the rights to the Big Ten at the time. And you were working with Coach Perlis, which I didn't know. So I was in a room with the coaches, and just presenting scheduling ideas and what the schedule was going to look like, so the coaches understood, what their schedule could be, how often they'd be on TV that season, how they could play on all the different things. And so you walked in with Coach Perlis in that meeting, and I had not seen you obviously since that 1975 season. This was probably in the mid 90s. So it was probably 20 years later, roughly. And I remember just like sort of looking and then hearing your name being introduced in the room, kind of confirmed. I sort of thought it was you. And then when I heard the name, I came over to you and said, wow, this is crazy. I'm sure you don't remember me, but I played for you for that one season. And all you need to know about that season was I played varsity football in the freshman. I'm the last person in my high school because they dropped the program after that season. I was the last person to graduate with a football letter. And all you need to know is I wrestled at 115 pounds that year and played quite a bit, and actually shockingly saw the field in lots of games. So we learned a lot together that year. I know I did, just about, trying to tough things out. And that you're overmatched, because we were overmatched. And we had it wasn't coaching, I can tell you that. We had some really interesting schemes, and the way we tried to go about playing was really unique and different, and trying to take advantage of some of the things that we could do. And, I still actually think about it really fondly, even though it was hard. We ended up, winning a game to end a very long losing streak that was in place before Coach Hoffman got there. So I just wanted you to know that I think about that a lot, and it was an important part of just everything that happened after. And I just, that season and everything else, I've loved football, a lot, even though I wasn't, going to play. So I just wanted you to know that that season was pretty impactful for me.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. And the reason I didn't recognize you 20 years later is you grew up. You got a lot taller, you're a lot bigger. You played at about 115 pounds back in 75.
Oh my God. We had a play where I can remember this I've told the story so many times, where we would just grab our helmet and signal to the quarterback, and he would just hit the center. And if you grab the outside of your helmet, you kind of ran a fade. If you grab the inside, you ran a slant. And if you grab the middle, he just threw it straight to you. The problem was, after a couple of times of doing it, they kind of caught on, and you couldn't run the play anymore. But we ran it at least once or twice every game.
Yeah. Well,
anyway, I know you've got more important questions than to talk about all of that, but I just wanted to make sure that
we'll get into a couple of
understood our connection.
And Tony, I mean, with the success and the accomplishments you've had in your career, you now leading the largest Power Four conference in the country, the Big Ten Conference. everyone on this podcast is very familiar with the Big Ten. And I just wonder, from your perspective, what is the best part about being the commissioner of a Power Four conference, and what's the toughest part?
Yeah, well, the first thing is it's an absolute privilege. I mean, the history of the Big Ten, you guys all know it well. It's a huge responsibility. It's a privilege to have the job. You're representing incredible institutions and student athletes and coaches and administrators. So that part is just, remarkable opportunity to be able to do that. And I've been fortunate to have some really good opportunities throughout my career. But to be honest, like leading something like the Big Ten, there's just nothing like that. And even at this later part of my career, it's still, kind of have to pinch myself a lot to think that I've gotten this opportunity to do this. Especially at this time when it's such a transformative time in college athletics where things are changing so quickly, and to be in a conference that has a huge voice in those changes with great leadership in our presidents and chancellors and our ADs and coaches, all of that. So that's kind of the opportunity. I would say the other piece about it is that what's the most enjoyable part of the job is being at all games. It doesn't matter, being on campus, there's just nothing like it, being around young people and watching how they interact with their coaches. I was at a field hockey game at Northwestern the other day, and they're, either one or two in the country, depending on the day. And so that was remarkable to watch that. And then, traveled the next morning to Ohio State for the Iowa game. And there's just, you have those opportunities. And a lot of times when I'm on campus, I'll get to watch practices and see and talk with some of the student athletes. But that part of the job, you can't duplicate. It's just great being around all of that. I think the difficulty is, and the hard part of the job is just trying to protect everything while you also have to change. And so you want to make sure that we get these changes right, because what's at stake is really, really important. Education and opportunity, all of those things. Like, as a Division III baseball player, baseball gave me an opportunity to do a lot of things. And I was clearly not good enough to play at a high level, but I got to play and I loved every second of it. And for these kids, they've squeezed through a pretty incredible funnel to be an athlete in the Big Ten. To be, that type of a student, that type of an elite athlete is pretty remarkable in all the championships that we stage. So I think the challenge and the hard part is making sure we get it right so that, all of the great things about this stay in place, yet at the same time, we adjust and do more for students that we have to do. And that's where we are today.
Tony, I wanted to ask you, in terms of conference bragging rights, and everyone wants to be the number one conference. I think right now people say, well, it's either the SEC or the Big Ten. What's more important, having a team win the national championship in football, having a multitude of teams that could win the national championship, maybe you have 4 or even 5 that would make the college football playoff, or to have the kind of conference it looks like you might have this year with no bad teams, and every game, every week is exciting, and you don't know the results until it's 0-0.
Yeah, I'm going to say D, all the above. You didn't give me that choice, but I'm going to go with D, which is all the above. You want all of it, to be honest. Like, you live and die in non-conference games at every level. It gives you a chance to root. It's the only time you can really root in this job is when you're playing a non-conference game. And so you really care deeply about that. But look, I think, one of the things that I know you guys focus a lot on the playoff and just going deeper. And it's just, it's funny. I think some people thought that when they expanded the playoff, it'd be easier to figure out who the 12 teams are because you're going deeper. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just as hard as it's ever been. It started with the BCS when it was only 2 and then went to 4 and now it's a 12. And it's still going to be really difficult. It's very difficult to make judgments between teams when they don't play each other or they don't play a common opponent in some cases. So, what we care about is just making sure, and I say this about the playoff, like having worked at MLB, the most important thing about any playoff for a sport, whether it's professional sport, college, is does it make the regular season better? Like, is it all work together? And what I really care about in the Big Ten, and I've said this a lot, is I want as many teams playing meaningful games as late in the season as possible. Right? That's what gets people excited. That's what builds interest. That could change a program's direction. All of those things are critical. And that's what a great playoff format does that. And I think we were on our way with this format and we'll see how it evolves. But I mean, you want more teams to play games that matter. And I think the other thing, and you guys have all been around the game a lot, the bar for what it took to make to have a chance to win the national championship was so high. It almost had to be perfect. And we've seen cases of undefeated teams not giving a chance to play for the national championship, or one-loss teams coming out of extremely difficult leagues not having a chance to play and being forced to make a decision. And so um, I think this is a really important step, and just making that sense of profession just sort of go away a little bit. No professional sport has that. Like, I like there are NFL teams that'll be barely above 500, and they might host a playoff game, and we start ruling teams out when they get that second loss. And so I think we're on a better path right now. We'll put this in place, and then we'll see like how we can continue to tweak it. Playoff formats always change. Every sport, you can go back and look over history, formats are always changing. And, I think hopefully we'll get this right this next couple of years, and then we'll see where we go from there.
So, Tony, as a follower of college football for 60 years now, not to date myself, but back to 1964, when there would be one televised game, the game of the week, and only, each team could only be in like once, and then there was a wild card. Remember that, Jack, at the end of the year?
Yeah.
But now I was home. Michigan was on the road, so I'm home watching college football weekend, enjoying all these games. I'm looking at the distance that Miami flies to Cal Berkeley for a conference game in the ACC, and then USC makes their second trek to the Midwest. And I'm all about the expansion. I think that's very cool. But I almost think I'm wondering what they're thinking, like with USC and UC making these treks. I mean, do you think that this is going to be sustainable, where they might not be, is there going to be buyer remorse? My God, we're flying back there again. And I know it's about money and exposure and a great conference, but do you ponder the idea that maybe these teams might not want to do it this way?
I don't worry about that in football. I think some of the scheduling in Olympic sports is a little bit trickier, and what we've told our coaches in those sports is that we'll continue to evaluate those schedules and do things that could address travel. Like, we've done the best job we can to build schedules across the 28 sports, and not every member we have plays in every sport, as you guys know. So we're trying to hopefully get a lot more right, but we'll listen. Like, I'm just a big believer in talking to the coaching groups. They're the ones that live it every day. They deal with the student athletes, what the performance is. Football is a little unique because it's, the once a week nature and the ability and how you travel and when you arrive. But look, it's not easy. There's no doubt that, the Big Ten schedule is a pretty tough gauntlet for everybody, whether, put the travel on top of that. But in general, just the schedule that we ask guys to play, the fact that we have the 9 conference games, all of those things I think are relevant. But I will tell you, one of the things we hear is the excitement, and hopefully that's a lasting thing about, I think student athletes want to play against the best. They want to be coached by the best, and they want to be challenged. And so I feel really good about, the opportunity. And look, there's a matchup this weekend, right? It's coming up with Ohio State and Oregon. And, we had a lot of games that sound like Rose Bowls to those of us that are old enough to remember that world. And I worked on that. I worked on, when the Pac-10, the Big Ten, and the Rose Bowl were all under one TV contract, and the CFA was another. And to your point, it went from one game a week to regionalization. Everybody was regionalized. Some games went to 20% of the country, some went to 30, and now we're in a world where everything is on pretty much everywhere. So it definitely continues to evolve. But I feel good about where we are. I feel good about the strength of the league, and and what it means. And look, we'll keep evolving, and we'll make sure that we get the feedback to understand if there are things we can do better. We're going to make sure we at least listen.
Tony, I don't know how closely you follow the other conferences, but it's kind of natural that you probably would. We all do. As we look at a 12-team bracket, to me, it just makes such great sense, because in the past, there were 4, 5, or 6 sets of fans across the country that felt they really had a shot, a sincere shot, a realistic shot at getting into the playoff. Now, there's at least 3 times that many, if not 4, 5, or 6 times, because it's so evolving every week. There's just the upsets every week, new people coming on board, new teams, I should say, making it into the top 20, et cetera. But if I could make you the czar of college football selection committee, and I'm not going to ask you to pick the Big Ten, who would you look at as likely candidates to come out as champions of the other 3 Power 4 conferences for the bracket?
That's tough. I get in trouble when I talk about others, so I'm not going to let you bait me into that, because then it'll be somewhere I'll be saying that I think X team needs to be in the postseason. So I'm going to stay away from that. But I will tell you, what I would say is, look at this past weekend. 5 teams in the top 11 went on the road and lost conference games, and one, squeaked out a win You know, the game that you referenced earlier with Miami at Cal, it could have been 6 potential teams in the top 11 that played road conference games. That just shows you, 3 of those games were in the SEC and 2 of the games were in the Big Ten. And it just shows you how hard it is, like, to win conference games in the road. And that's why I think, some of these comparisons are really difficult. Like, it's tough. And I think, look, I'm biased and I sit in the Big Ten. I feel like our league is an extremely difficult league to get through. And we made it a lot harder with the additions that we put in. And the schedules that we're playing. So I feel like that's the case, but like, this is not easy. And, you are going to lose games on the road. Like, you can be a very, very good football team and you'll stumble a couple of times in a road game and maybe even at home. Like, it's tough. And so I think, again, I get back to what I said before, like, you want that playoff format to reward that conference play. You don't want to, and you also want to make sure that we create incentives to play strong non-conference games. If we got to make sure that we're qualifying the right way so that, games like we saw this year with Texas, Michigan, and, and LSU and USC playing early in the season, those are among the 2 most watched games of the year for a very good reason. Like, fans like those matchups. And we got to make sure that the format and the way we schedule encourages those regular season games to still be played. Because I think fans and the players and the coaches want to be in those games. But you got to make sure that, you get rewarded for playing them in terms of how people look at your season, and that you don't get punished for losing one of those games, whether it's close or not. And I think that's the sweet spot. And look, we'll learn a lot more about this. Like, no one's gone through the 12 and no one's seen how the selection is going to work. So we'll go through it. I do know for sure that, actually Ward Manuel at Michigan is the chair of the selection committee this year, and he's a football guy through and through, and he'll do a really good job of leading that committee. These guys they put tremendous effort into the work they do in the committee. It's not an easy, no one on that committee takes it lightly. They know what's at stake. And so I think they'll do a really good job. And it's our job to give them the tools that we need to be successful and then adjust when we see the results.
Thank you,
Tony. We really appreciate your time tonight. I have one other quick question for you. Kids all over the country grow up dreaming of playing in Big Ten football stadiums. And then a few of them realize maybe they'd be better off coaching. And then 1 or 2 might say, it'd really be fun, would be the AD. If someone said they wanted to be Tony Petitti and they wanted to be a conference commissioner, what course would you tell them to take? Would you want them to be a coach, administrator, a TV guy? And how would your life have changed if you had had better high school football coaching?
Yeah, I could have been maybe a better possession receiver, but I don't know. I still probably would have played baseball. What I would say about all of that is, like, I learned this early on because I was really, really fortunate. I had great bosses, and I would tell young people the number one thing is who you do it for is so critical when you start, because I just was lucky to be exposed to so many different things. I had jobs that I didn't even know existed, like, the year before I got them. And that was because I got in and people gave me opportunities. They took me with them to meetings and exposed, like, who you work for is so critical, what you do, investing in yourself, casting the net wide, and just learning how to get those opportunities. Like, I look back on it and I can never tell anybody, like, hey, do these 3 things or 4 things, but I can tell you the first thing you should make sure you do is work with great people, work for great people, and you'll go a long way. It's no different than playing for a great coach. And Ken, you were a really good high school football coach, and I'm glad I played for you.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate
Big
that.
Ten Conference Commissioner Tony Petitti. Tony, thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, guys. Enjoyed it. I'll see you again. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen. Time for us to talk about our top 12 rankings and how we think the bracket might look for the playoff. Tom Crawford, let's start with you. What do you have this week?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of changes based on the 4 upsets and the near 5th upset in the top 11 that Tony was referring to. But I'm a big optics guy. I'm a visual. I'm all guy. I'm about visual. And I watched Ohio State play Iowa. Now it was a 7-0 game at halftime. But hey, there's so much sheer talent on that field. So I moved them into number 1 with Alabama falling. I got Texas number 2, and then Penn State, I think you're going to find out more this week, but they're my number 3. Oregon, I watched against Michigan State. I thought, even when Dylan Gabriel making mistakes, they were terrific. So they're at 4. And then Georgia's going to hang there where they should be. Miami probably got lucky to beat Cal, but they found a way and they had to go a long way. Watch out for Iowa State, though. And I know you, Ken, have been bullish on Iowa State. They're going to be that they could be that team in the Big 12. Ole Miss rebounded; they're on their way back. Alabama, sheer talent, no defense, and then Tennessee, not a bad loss down in Fayetteville. Winning at Arkansas is difficult; it really is, and they should have won that game. They had a 14-3 lead. Clemson's bouncing back. After their loss to Georgia, they're number 11. And then lastly, and I watched that game as well, Ken, about A&M, and you made some really good points having their quarterback back. Wow, they absolutely pulverized Missouri. And Missouri is way overranked. We knew that going in. But, man, they've bounced back from that Notre Dame loss. So watch out for the Aggies. SEC is just loaded, dripping with talent. Are we back, Jack? Yeah.
There's your bracket, Tom.
Yeah. No, Jack, we lost him. Now he's zooming back in here. Do you want to go with Jack? Can you hear us? Why don't you go with maybe Ben? Why don't we go with Ken's next? While Jack is working with his technical stuff. Do you want to go with yours, Ken?
Sure. Yeah, our top 12 looks very, very similar. Tom, with two exceptions. At the top, it was very debatable for me whether it should be Texas or Ohio State, but my rationale for putting Texas first, and this is just my rationale, but I thought that their victories over Michigan and Mississippi State were slightly better than Ohio State's wins over Michigan State and Iowa. It's like, being nitpicky, I guess. But that's just the way I felt. So I kept Texas at number 1, Ohio State number 2. I agreed with you, Penn State at number 3. They have defeated West Virginia, Illinois, UCLA, and defensively, they've really stepped up. They held Illinois to 7 points and UCLA to 11. So I really like what I see there at Penn State. I've got Georgia 4. Yes, they lost the game to Alabama. They've beaten Clemson and Kentucky and Auburn. I mean, that's, to me, they're the best one-loss team. Miami at 5, I wanted to move them up, but I couldn't, even though they're 6-0. And the reason I couldn't move them up is because they just squeaked by in these last two victories. And they had to really sprint to get by this last one at Cal. But I've got them in there undefeated at number 5. I've got Oregon 6. They could have moved up. You can make a great argument for Oregon being higher than 6, but they've got some convincing wins, and they beat Boise State by only 3, but they beat them. And so I've got it's going to be a great matchup with Ohio State coming up. Iowa State I have at the top of the Big 12. They've, of course, beat Iowa, and they've had solid wins recently over Houston and Baylor. Big 12 wins. I've got them at the top of the Big 12 right now. Alabama drops from number 1 to number 8. Of course, that was their first loss to Vanderbilt in 40 years, and what a shocker. Obviously, the biggest upset of the season. Have Ole Miss at 9. They're 5-1, but their only loss, if you remember, was a 3-point loss to Kentucky. Pretty good Kentucky team. And as you've already said, you're gonna lose games on the road. That's just going to happen. I've got Clemson at 10. They are a completely different team from the team that lost its opening game in week 1, and they're just pounding people right now. So Clemson looks like a top 10 team. I've got them at number 10 right now. Tennessee number 11. Their only loss, of course, just happening at Arkansas, which, as Tom mentioned, is a very tough place to play. And 12 could be, I have BYU. I think they've done a great job in the Big 12. They've beaten a good Southern Methodist team, Kansas State, Baylor. But that could also be Pitt at 5-0. That could be Notre Dame. That could even be Indiana. So kind of wide open there toward the bottom of those top 12. And so in the playoff, Texas would be the number 1 seed as the winner of the SEC. Ohio State number 2 at the Big Ten champion. Miami still would be right now in this snapshot this week The champion of the ACC and Iowa State would be number 4. So number 12 I have, which would have been BYU, they get bumped out by Boise State because we have to have the top-ranked team from the group of 5. That's right now Boise State. So number 12 Boise State, or I should say seeded number 12 Boise State, would go to the number 5 seed Penn State for the right to play Iowa State. You got Ole Miss at the 9 seed going to the 8 seed Alabama for the right to play Texas. That looks like an SEC game, does it not?
Yeah.
And then the 11th seed Tennessee goes to number 6 Georgia for the right to play Miami. And then it's rounded out with 10 seed Clemson going to number 7 seed Oregon for the right to play Ohio State in the quarterfinals.
Interesting. Ken, I have a lot of the same teams that you do in a little different order. And like Tom, I have Ohio State number 1, Texas 2, but we're going to know an awful lot about Ohio State. Toughest road challenge going to Autzen and trying to beat the Ducks, a game they've been waiting for a year. That's the marquee game this weekend. And Penn State number 4. So 3 of the first 4 are Tony Petitti's league. Then Georgia and Alabama. I think those teams are so close. Last week I just had Bama ahead, but after that loss, moved them down. Miami, I couldn't move them up. I wanted to move them down further. I think they've been extremely fortunate to win the last 2 weeks on some questionable calls. One that reversed a pass in the end zone, the other one on a targeting call that I don't know how that was not made late in that game. I have Iowa State 8. I think they've answered the bell every week. BYU 9 because they're the only team that has 3 true road wins. And value road wins a great deal. Tennessee dropped them back quite a bit to number 10. I have Boise State, number 11. And you watched them play Oregon, you watch them now, and I think they are a dominant team. And Clemson is going to get better and is getting better. So those are the teams that I have in my top 12, and I've got about 10 waiting to get in, including Indiana, which will move in next week with a win. And looking at my bracket, you can see Oregon going up against Clemson for the right to play Iowa State. You have BYU and Bama there for the right to play Ohio State. You have Boise State, the 11th seed, and Penn State for the right to play Miami. I think Penn State would love to be in that position. And you have an SEC eliminator with Tennessee and Georgia for the right to play Texas. 3 SEC teams going at it. But guys, the one thing I want to alert you to is 2 5-0 teams that didn't make it, but if they keep winning, one of them will get in. And even if it means that I have 2 non-power 4 teams in the field, Army and Navy, undefeated. Both of them 5-0 for the first time since 1945, and they both get a whack at Notre Dame. And if either of them beats the Irish and then goes on and beats the other military academy and finishes 12-0, I got to get them in somehow.
Agreed. Couldn't agree more.
Tom, what do you make of Ken's look at it and what I had to say?
There's just, it's such, it's splitting hairs with a lot of these teams. I mean, the takeaway from my perspective is that going on the road in any league is murder row. I mean, what happened to Alabama going to Vandy should wake up everybody. You got to be ready to play on the road. So, I mean, I know every week there's going to be a tweak and next week there's going to be more tweaks. But we had changes this week when there was no big glaring games in college football. Yeah. This is why college football to me is at its all-time high. And here, this is coming off when my team won a national championship, and now all of a sudden they're slinking back into irrelevancy in terms of a playoff. But I'm enjoying this season more than ever because it's back to that parity thing. There's no guaranteed wins, and it's all the issues, the portal, and flying across the country and all that goes into that. And the fact that you're having to play, I mean, Michigan's playing Washington in a conference game. Look in the Big Ten, Michigan State going to Oregon. Look at what Michigan State's had to do the last 3 games. A good BC team, and then they play Ohio State and Oregon. Then they got a bye week to take a breath. Then they got Iowa coming to town, and they got Michigan.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why it's getting to be more like the NFL, and maybe this was the goal to make college football more like the NFL in terms of parity. But you're seeing it right now, so I'm super excited, and the fact that this week was not a big glaring week of big matchups, and look what happened. I think every week's going to be nuts, and I love it every minute of it.
Tom, when you have a week like this, I'm with you. And I thought last week was riveting, compelling. We've had a couple of other weeks where we haven't had any games like that. We've had a lot of 49-7 games. And when that happens, I can turn on the National Football League on a weekend, and every other game comes down to the last drive.
Yeah.
So
like yesterday or
exactly.
the other day.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was crazy.
If you have that parity combined with the pageantry and the passion of college football, then I think you've got the ideal game.
You got it conquered right there, and that's why I think the TV monies, don't you think, Ken, are coming to college? I mean, that's why these big packages, you're going to get interest in people that weren't interested before when there was just a presumed blowout coming. I mean, other than Purdue playing anybody, because they've really dropped off.
Yeah.
I mean, these Big Ten games are going to be crazy.
Yeah. Ken, I think it's time for us to take a look at the next week and our pick 6, our games to watch. Ken, of these games, which one? Maybe Ohio State, Oregon is an obvious choice, but what games are must-see TV for you?
Well, it's clear that Ohio State, Oregon is going to take center stage this weekend. But I'm really interested in seeing Texas going to Oklahoma. Oklahoma is not quite the same team as they've been in the past, but that's a great rivalry, right? We all know about it. I'm going to be very excited to see that. And then I think, LSU is kind of hiding in the bushes, and Ole Miss goes to LSU. So I think that's going to be a great one. I guess I like all those games, to tell you the truth, Jack.
Tom, what about you?
Well, and the Texas-Oklahoma game would be interesting. And by the way, it's at a neutral site. It's at the Cotton Bowl, and I've attended that 3 times, and that is a great game. That is a bucket list game, like Jack talked, half red, half burnt orange. I think Texas is going to roll OU. I mean, I think it's going to get out of hand. But the game I'm really intrigued by is Penn State at USC, because now Penn State's got to make that trek. Going the opposite direction. USC's had to do this twice now. Now they get them at home. They got it home. They got some talent, and going against Lincoln Riley. I mean, I'm picking USC in the upset in that game, right? And that USC's not even ranked right now. There's that game that's really interesting to me. Captain Obvious, Ohio State at Oregon. Yeah, that's gonna be interesting.
Yeah.
Nebraska, Indiana. When is one of those teams gonna? When is one of those teams going to, kind of go back to their old ways? Indiana, I mean, they're at home and they'll be crazy down there at Memorial Stadium. But watch out for Nebraska. They beat a good Rutgers team last week. Yeah. And so that one intrigues me as well.
Tom, I'm going to give you a chance to win a lunch if you would like. I look at that Penn State secondary. I think it's pretty good. And I know the Nittany Lions could run the football. And I haven't seen USC stop a decent running game yet. They certainly couldn't stop either U of M team that the Trojans face. So I like Penn State comfortably in that game. But I am, like you, also very interested in Nebraska at Indiana. And Indiana hasn't had a start like this since 1967. So
I understand that, Jack, but I watched that Northwestern Indiana game at that soccer field over there. I'm surprised people just didn't go to the beach right there. I mean, that setting was unbelievable. But to heck with the game. But I was not impressed with Indiana in that game.
Okay.
Optically, I think they're bruising for a reality check here. One of these weekends. It might be this weekend, even at home. So I'm not a complete believer, and I'm impressed by them. I mean, Harry Gonzo time, John Eisenberger, that was the last time. I mean, that's a long time ago. But yeah, I'm Nebraska could pull that one off. It could.
Ken, your final thoughts on next week and what we've had today? It was great to have Commissioner Tony Petitti of the Big Ten with us.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, that's been the highlight of my year, I have to tell you, and for very good reason, clearly. But I agree with you, Jack. I think Penn State's defense is going to win out this coming week, even though they make the long trek over to the West Coast. We'll see. And I think Nebraska, I'm kind of like Tom. I really like Indiana, although you weren't impressed with them last week. I like what they've done, at the big picture, the body of work this year. But Nebraska, I think, is just a better team, and we're going to find out. It's going to be great to see.
Yeah.
I want to see what Nebraska does on the road.
Yeah.
We've seen a few teams win bowl games or win road games, including Indiana. I want to see how Nebraska travels. And if they can win in Bloomington, hey, they'll be a one-loss team that will have some designs on getting into the playoff toward the end, sneaking into that 10, 11, 12 range. Gentlemen, great to talk with you again this week. Bluebelly Tom Crawford, and Ken Hoffman is one of the co-founders of the Motor City Bowl and Little Caesars Pizza Bowl. Jack Ebling saying, have a great week, everyone. See you next week.